Debate has been postponed to a later date. That's the one on miners and mining communities. So we are now going to move on to the Select Committee statement on behalf of the Levelling Up, Housing and Communities Committee. Mr. Clive will speak for up to 10 minutes, during which no interventions can be taken. At the conclusion of his statement, I will call members to ask questions on the subject of the statement. These should be brief questions and not speeches. Can I emphasise that questions should be directed to the Select Committee Chair and not the relevant Government Minister. Front benchers may take part in questioning also. I call Mr. Clive Betts.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. It gives me great pleasure to introduce this statement on behalf of the Levelling Up Housing and Communities Committee in reference to the report that is published on financial distress in local authorities. First of all, could I thank the Leader of the House for putting forward the business of the House motion to allow this statement to take place. Our committee clerk is excited by the fact that apparently we have set a procedural precedent today, which I certainly wasn't aware of, but I am now. I'd also obviously like to thank the Backbench Business Committee for originally providing the time for this statement. Our inquiry, Mr. Deputy Speaker, looked into the extent of the funding gap in local authorities' finances and some of the main spending challenges which they face: social care, special education needs and homelessness. This report brings attention to key issues ahead of the upcoming local government financial settlement. It makes recommendations not only for urgent action to resolve the immediate crisis, but also larger reforms for a government to consider after the next election. Everyone recognises that the financial crisis in local councils across England is out of control. In recent months, there have been an alarming number of local authorities issuing Section 114 notices. These notices are the local authorities' admissions that their spending is exceeding their income, effectively declaring bankruptcy. In the last 6 years, 8 local authorities have issued these notices. In the previous 18 years, none did. It is no longer just the case that a small number of individual councils with particular issues are in financial distress. We are now seeing widespread financial distress across large parts of local government, and the situation is only getting worse. The committee has heard evidence from the LGA that 1/5 of councils may be in financial distress within the next year. At the heart of this crisis is a multi-billion-pound funding gap. The income available for local authorities from council tax, retained business rates and government grants has not kept pace with the increased demand for their services and the effect of inflation. As a result, the Local Government Association estimates that local authorities face a funding gap of £4 billion over the next 2 years to maintain services at current levels. Witnesses have told us that the current funding system is broken and not fit for purpose. Successive governments since 2010 have reduced the level of central government grants awarded to local authorities by around 50%. This has been partly offset by a 20% increase in council tax, which has therefore led to an overall reduction in local authority core spending power of 26% in real terms between 2010 and 21. In the short term, local authorities need immediate additional funding. Our report recommends that the government must include additional funding in the local government finance settlement for 24-25 to fill the gap. Last week, the government announced £600 million worth of extra funding. And I give credit to the local government minister, who has been assiduous in listening to the views of MPs on this subject. All I would say to him is these measures are welcome, but they're not sufficient. Our report also recognises that the government has recently begun consultations on other methods to increase the funds available to local authorities. We have cautiously welcomed the fact that the government is considering giving local authorities additional capital flexibilities to fund day-to-day costs. But we have recommended that these additional flexibilities should be carefully considered and limited to extending flexibilities over invest-to-save activity only. We don't want to store up problems for future years. Our report also recommends other ways the government can improve funding for local authorities in the medium term. We repeated the recommendation that our committee first made in 2021 that the government must urgently reform council tax. This will involve undertaking a revaluation of properties and introducing additional council tax bands. Finally, we've once again called for the government to implement the business rates reset and fair funding review, which they committed to in 2016 and have yet to deliver, and to reintroduce multi-year settlements. Our inquiry asked witnesses what had caused the sharp rise in council expenditures. It identified 3 particular areas where costs have risen significantly: adult and children's social care, special education needs and homelessness. On adult social care, the increasingly complex needs of a changing population continue to drive up costs. Long-term workforce shortages and inflationary pressures have made this worse. As the committee recommended back in 2022, the government needs to recognise that local authorities will need several £1 billion of additional funding each year to continue to deliver and improve adult social care, and should plan a sustainable mechanism to deliver this funding, which does not simply rely on increasing council tax. That is not a viable way forward. On children's social care, our inquiry found that councils are facing rising demand for residential care placements and a poorly functioning market for providing them. This has driven significant cost increases. Our report recommends an urgent comprehensive reform of the children's social care system. As part of this, the government should help local authorities consider greater collaboration, so between them they can deliver more children's care services directly instead of through the private suppliers. Our inquiry has also found that local authorities are facing significant financial pressures from services for children and young people with special education needs and disabilities. The number of educational, health and care plans has skyrocketed since they were introduced in 2014. This has significantly increased demand for more expensive forms of SEND provision and home-to-school transport. Funding is provided to local authorities through the Dedicated Schools Grant, but it is not enough to meet demand and does not cover home-to-school transport. The government has already been forced to take temporary measures to prevent SEND costs, forcing a number of councils into bankruptcy. In 2020, the government introduced a statutory override, allowing local authorities to exclude any deficits on their DSG spending from their main revenue budgets. Local government faces a potential cliff edge of Section 114 notices whenever the statutory override comes to an end. The question is the Treasury going to write off that extra borrowing when the time comes? Therefore, our report recommends that in the short term, the government should provide additional funding for home-to-school transport. In the long term, there needs to be a fundamental reform of the education, health and care plans based on a cross-government review. Finally, our report makes it clear that the rising levels of homelessness have increased costs for councils. A big cause of the increase has been the government's decision to freeze local housing allowance rates in April 2020. Our report therefore recommends that welcomes the government's recent announcement that it will increase local housing allowance rates from April 2024. However, it does raise concern that the government has then decided to refreeze the rates in 2026. Instead, we recommend that local housing allowance should be retained at least the 30% decile of local market rents. In the longer term, the best solution, as the committee has recommended repeatedly, is to build more social housing, which will always be cheaper than paying for temporary accommodation. These problems, Mr Deputy Speaker, require a long-term solution. That is why the committee has made recommendations in this report for whichever government is elected after the next election. The next government, regardless of their political persuasion, must embark on a fundamental review of the systems of local authority funding, local taxation, both council tax and business rates. In doing so, it must be clear about what local authorities are for and how they can best coordinate with the delivery of government's wider objectives. We recommended the next government should consider many options, which may include land value taxes, but others as well, and wider fiscal devolution in doing so. It must also explore all options for reforming funding and delivery of social care services to address the underlying causes of the acute funding and delivery pressures currently facing local authorities. It is my hope, Mr Deputy Speaker, that the need we have identified for additional funding will be properly reflected in the local government financial settlement we will debate next week, and that our other recommendations will be carefully considered by this government and whoever forms the government after the next election. I commend this report to the House.
Thank you very much for your statement, Mr Betts. Bob Blackman, and I intend to call the front benches at the end if everybody's happy with that. Bob Blackman.
Right, very much, Mr Deputy Speaker, and I thank the Chairman of the Select Committee for what he said. Quite clearly, one of the problems here is that adult social services, children's social services and homelessness are all demand-led services, of which it's very difficult for a local authority to predict how many people and how much money is going to be required. Does he agree with me that what the government and the department need to look at now is how we can enable local authorities to have a pool of money nationally that could be used by local authorities when these demand-led services have dramatically increased the burden on a particular local authority.
Could I thank the honourable member, I say the Honourable Select Committee friend, because he's been part of all these debates and always the committee report was unanimous. He's absolutely right. We have to find a way of funding social care, the specific parts and the general social care issues. Council tax simply cannot meet that burden. You can't keep putting council tax up to cover it. And that leads on to the additional challenge, doesn't it? That for most people who don't receive social care, what they're seeing every year is their council tax goes up, but the services they do get, the libraries, the parks, the buses, the road sweeping, all get reduced. They're paying more and getting less, and that's not sustainable in the long term.
Khalid Mahmood.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. I commend my honourable friend from Sheffield South East for brilliant work that he's done. Would he concur with me in terms of local government funding? He will know that Birmingham is under special measures on Section 114, but the other services are hugely hit by the lack of funding, and one of the reasons why these councils are forced into this position is because the lack of funding, which normally used to go to the reserves, which are not able to reserve, and so keep them out of bankruptcy, and that's a real issue of not proper funding for local authorities.
Thank my honourable friend for that question, and I recognise the particular problems of Birmingham. And yes, some councils have declared 114 units have got very specific problems, and we know about the equal pay issues in Birmingham. Some councils have perhaps brought those problems on themselves. I'm not referring to Birmingham, but generally other councils. But the challenge, of course, is, as we say in this report, it isn't just individual councils with particular problems now. It's the generality of local government under pressure, as was all our witnesses said to us. And in that situation, any particular challenging problem that comes to a council on top of the general problems can tip it over the edge.
Peacock.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. And Barnsley Council has seen some of the biggest cuts to its budget in the country, and I really thank my honourable friend for his report. I think the fact they've had the biggest cuts, or some of the biggest cuts, makes it even more impressive that they've been given 2 awards for being Council of the Year. But to date, my constituency of Barnsley East has received no levelling up funding, and of course levelling up funding is a bit of a drop in the ocean compared to the figures my honourable friend was discussing. But we are awaiting the decision on our final bid, which comes under the Cultural Fund. So I wondered if the Select Committee has any knowledge of when that might be announced. And I of course note that the Minister is in his place, and I hope he will look on the LSICA bid very favourably.
Thank you, my honourable friend. Now, if it was in my gift, of course I would give Barnsley the money they're asking for today, but unfortunately it isn't. Look, we've been fairly critical in another report of the individual pots for levelling up, which aren't joined up together, and some councils can get bits of money from all these pots, others get nothing at all, which is really unsatisfactory. We have suggested that what we ought to move to are single pots for authorities to address these particular problems, reflecting their needs, but also giving the greater discretion and freedom to decide on that spending at local level. I think we're quite a long way off that at this stage. In principle, I think the government recognises that's the way to travel, but it's still not really got a roadmap about how we're going to get there.
Nadia Whittome.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker, and I thank my honourable friend for all his work on this important report. It's a privilege to serve on the Levelling Up Housing and Communities Committee under his chairship. The chair of the committee doesn't need me to tell him that, like many local authorities, Nottingham City Council is in a perilous financial position. Our council spending power is being cut by a huge 28% compared to 2010. Despite high levels of deprivation in our city, this is considerably higher than the average and still devastating reduction of 19% among councils. How important does he believe it is to make the funding system for local government fairer?
Thanks, my honourable friend, for that question. I completely agree. The only caveat I will put on is what's one authority's system of fair funding is another authority's unfair funding, and that's always the challenge here. But I think everyone accepts that you have to bring the funding system up to date. The current funding system has data in it which goes back to the last century. That is not a reasonable way to allocate money in the current age. So yes, it needs to be revised. And it is true certainly, that what has happened with the funding cuts and the increase in council tax, the biggest funding cuts have tend to come to those councils which used to receive the most grant, which tend to be the poorer councils. The council tax increases have disadvantaged councils with a low council tax base, which tend to be those councils who receive the biggest cuts. Now, we haven't gone into that in detail in this report, but I know we've had evidence to that effect in the past.
Burgon. Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker, and thank you to the Chair of the Select Committee for this important report, which makes sobering reading for members on all sides of the House. And isn't it the case, and would the Chair of the Select Committee agree, that the reason that the measures he sets out in his report are so necessary in Leeds are the fact that government funding to Leeds City Council has been cut by the Conservative government by £2.5 billion since 2010, has left Leeds City Council, an excellent Labour-run council, with a shortfall of £65 million for the 2024 to 2025 financial year, that the cuts of £2.5 billion in government funding since 2010 equate to about £75 million per ward. And as the council struggles to deliver vital, essential services for some of the most vulnerable people in our city, isn't that the reason that everyone, regardless of political party, needs to really support the measures set out in this report?
Thank my friend for that question. Very clearly, we set out that the problem is the fact that funding has been cut, and that is a reduction in central government grant, with council tax increases not only partly but not wholly replacing it. So that is an issue that does need addressing if we want councils to continue performing not merely the social care function but everything else that our communities rely on. But we do need a fundamental reform. That's what we're calling for the longer term. And of course that is a challenge for any government. And I look at both front benches here, because if you reform local finance, you mean some people are going to pay more and some are going to pay less. And I always say those people who pay more, never forget about it and continue to blame you for years to come. Those who pay less will thank you and forget about it next year. So it's always a challenge in terms of spreading around differently how your tax take is. But we are going to have to do it differently, because these services that council provide, not just social care, but the parks, the libraries, the buses, the roads, the environmental services, planning, economic development, which has almost fallen off the scale in some councils, are really important.
Imran Hussain.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. The reality remains that 14 years of ideological austerity cuts have left many authorities on the brink of bankruptcy. Bradford Council has had cuts of £100 million. That's just from 2015 until now. That's left our services decimated and our communities devastated and deprived of much needed services. So I welcome the report, and I thank the Chair of the Select Committee, and in particular the call for much needed and immediate funding for local authorities. Will he agree with me that the much needed funding must be given, and if it isn't given, any section 114 notice, the blame for which lies directly and squarely at the door of this government?
Thank my honourable friend. I think what the report says is not every 114 notice can be blamed at the government. There will be circumstances where councils get themselves into difficulties, but what we've said is there are a general problem coming now for councils, which is the problem created by the shortage of funding, and that's the one. And in Bradford's case, we did make reference to this. Bradford has a very particular problem of the young age of its population, the number of children. And Bradford has a situation where children's services are run by trustees appointed by the Secretary of State for Education. That body has demanded from the council an amount equivalent to about 50% of its council budget, and you could get the ridiculous situation where the Secretary of State for DLUC sends in commissioners to run services to try and find the money to pay the trustees who are appointed by the Secretary of State for Education. That doesn't seem a great way for local government to operate.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. Can I thank the Chair of the Select Committee for what I think is a very important report, and also for the members who have spent a significant amount of time really getting under the skin of the issue. Does the Chair of the Select Committee agree with me that ahead of the finance settlement next Wednesday, as it's scheduled to be, the government needs to finally take responsibility for the financial crisis in local government? And secondly, does he share my concern that the breakdown in local government audit is contributing to the removal of the early warning system?
Yes, thank my friend for that. It certainly is, and we've discussed and just produced a report about local government audit, and I think it's a real problem there. If accounts haven't been audited for 3 years in most cases, probably for longer in some cases, how do you know on earth what is actually happening in local council finances? So I think certainly getting local audit on an even keel by the end of this year is really important, but where accounts are qualified as they will be, then council shouldn't be blamed for that. It's this problem of the local audit system and the failures, and we've really got to sort that out. Absolutely right.
Simon Hall.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr Deputy Speaker, and on behalf of the Government, may I first of all thank the honourable gentleman, the Chairman of the Select Committee, and all of his colleagues on the committee for the work that they do in general, and on this report in particular. I'll obviously study it with great care and will respond in the usual way. Mr Deputy Speaker, the honourable gentleman referenced a number of points. I think we can all agree that certainty and security for the local government sector is important, and I concur with his view that there is clear merit in multi-year settlements. I also agree with him that whoever is standing at the government dispatch box in the role of local government minister after the next general election, I pray to God it's me, and I hope my prayers will be answered, that reforms are always going to be difficult and complex. I'd be interested to hear his view, Mr Deputy Speaker, as whether he sees any merit at all in establishing some cross-party working and blue sky thinking on this in order to hopefully land something which can deliver that certainty and security for 5, 10, 15, 20 years ahead, to give comfort to local government leaders, 151 officers and others.
I thank the Minister, and while I might not completely agree with his prayers, I actually do agree. I think if we're going to sort this out for the long term, particularly social care funding, we need a system which has general support, and the committee has called for that in the past. And what we did on pensions reform a few years ago, cross-party, has actually stuck. So I think there's merit in that suggestion. Whether we can achieve it, I don't know, but I think we ought to try.
Thank you very much for your statement and responding to the questions from back and front benches. Thank you very much. Point of order, Stephanie Peacock.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. This morning, the